All right, hello there, HPE 205. We are going to be covering Chapter 3 and 29 today, which is going to cover adapted sport and wheelchair performance. So, just to review, the following information you need to make sure you know from our Chapter 14 lecture, which is CP, what does it stand for? What's the definition? OI, what does that stand for? What's the definition? What's the IDEA definition? And classifications between those two. TBI, traumatic brain injury, what's the IDEA definition and classifications? And then knowledge around stroke and educational impact that may have. All right, so if you haven't watched Chapter 14 or you kind of forget, make sure you check your notes, be able to catch up on Chapter 14. All right, so, whoa, there's a lot on here. Examining legislation impact. So there used to be an act that was the Olympic and Amateur Sports Act. And then in 2020, a new act got passed, which took over the Olympic and Amateur Sports Act. And that is Empowering Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Athlete Act of 2020. So what is this act? Well, it came out of all of the impact of the gymnastics Olympic team with sexual abuse, misconduct. And so the bill really provides a safeguard for amateur athletes, both in the Olympics and Paralympics, from abuse, including sexual abuse by coaches or employees that fall under the USOC, which is the United States Olympic Committee, and the United States Paralympic Committee. So they call it the USOPC, including both the Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So now they have steps in place, which they didn't before, when it comes to athletes. And so one of those is that this bill requires an annual survey that's conducted by athletes anonymously about their experience within Olympics or Paralympics and their team. It also provides some safe sport, confidentialities, and no retaliation within the amateur athletes, Olympians or Paralympians, and coaches, trainers, and also includes a report to Congress if there's any impact as well. So this is a, relatively new act that got passed in 2020, really just providing much more empowerment to Olympians, Paralympians, and amateur athletes when it comes to abuse and sexual abuse. So 2 laws that we've covered earlier is the Rehab Act, Section 504, and also ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now we're going to look at these through the lens of sport and adapted sport. So one, the Rehab Act of 1973, Section 504, talks about that individuals with disabilities cannot be excluded from the participation in or denied the benefits of any program or activity that receives any sort of federal financial assistance. Title II, there's 5 titles within the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which was amended in 2008, passed in 1990, talks about that people with disabilities must have equal opportunity to participate in and benefit state and local government programs, services, and activities. All right, so this is including programs, services, and activities through state, local government. It could be public playgrounds that receive federal funds for it to be built, state parks, public transport, towns, cities, school districts, universities, community colleges, community libraries, right? Any such a programming that is being put on also needs to be accessible for individuals with disabilities. So even local wise, if they're providing programming, they really need to accommodate for individuals with disabilities as well. And so when we talk about adapted sport, we also talk about sport in a recreational level and a community level as well, not just elite level sport. The other area that we need to touch on when we're talking about legislation is this Government Accountability Office, right? And so in 2008, Congress issues a charge to this Government Accountability Office within the United States, wanting to know what is the current status of students with disabilities in physical education and sports. The Government Accountability Office went and visited many different schools across the nation looking at physical education and sports. And in 2010, the Government Accountability Office wrote a report back to Congress. As a result of what the Government Accountability Office found in 2011, the U.S. Department of Education charges the Office of Civil Rights to issue a report. Based upon that, there was a Dear Colleague letter which was sent out to all superintendents of public school districts, all athletic directors of public school districts, stating the results of this report regarding physical education and sports. And a Dear Colleague letter is almost like a little poke or reminder, push, that public schools need to be providing reasonable accommodation to programs offered to students without disabilities for students with disabilities regarding physical education and sports. So on to 2L, under supplemental information, there are 3 documents. The first one here to the left is the document from the GAO, right? And that was done in 2010. Then the middle document is from the Department of Education, and it summarizes the Government Accountability Office report and then looks at it through a lens through the Department of Education. And based upon that document, the Dear Colleague letter got sent out in 2013. So review all 3 of these documents. Specifically, the first couple pages of overview and guidelines will really provide you a lot of information that these documents found within the current status of physical education and sport for children and youth with disabilities within the United States. All right, and then let's watch this video here.
When I came back from the games, people didn't really know that the Paralympics happened. I wanted to join the high school track team, but I didn't have the right to run alongside of other runners when I was the only female wheelchair racer out there. I didn't understand why I was being discriminated against. Even coaches said I have a club of my own kind and that I really don't belong here. It was hurtful. And I thought, okay, we're gonna fight this. So we sued for no damages, so no money. We sued for the right for people with disabilities to participate in high school sports.
Disabilities are now being granted equal access to school sports programs. That mandate comes from the Obama administration.
I could run alongside of the runners.
For the first time in history, students with disabilities will now be included on sports teams at their local school.
It was a hard thing to go through, but the law became federal, called the Sports and Fitness Equity Law. Some people call it Tatiana's Law.
All right, so based upon that video, we can see that in Maryland, they have a state law that is the Fitness and Athletic Equality Law for students with disabilities, which was passed in 2008 and requires boards of education in different counties, all counties in Maryland, to grant students with disabilities equal opportunities to participate in physical education and mainstream athletic teams and sports. So it's not really a federal law, as stated in the video. It is a state law for the state of Maryland. And so almost every sport that is offered within the school districts within Maryland, they have to have also a way for students with disabilities to participate, or also an adapted sport or a unified sport So students with and without disabilities participating. And it really has increased the opportunity for students with disabilities to participate in sports within the K-12 school system. So when we look at sport as a framework and sports settings, there is the school-based sport, which is part of the school infrastructure. There's interscholastic or extracurricular, so competition against other schools, which is outside of the school hours, but still put on and sponsored by the school. And then there's also community and recreation centers and programming, ones that are specific to individuals with disabilities or ones that are more sports specific and may have programming and opportunities for individuals with disabilities or may not, right? And so when we look within the school setting, what are some of these key steps in order for us to implement and to provide more knowledge and understanding and inclusivity around adapted sport within the general physical education curriculum? So step one is the easiest, is to cross-reference a general sport with an adapted sport, right? Down in this picture in the lower right is wheelchair tennis. And so when we're teaching a tennis unit, we can provide, yes, the rules of the general sport of tennis, but then we can also expand that and cover some adapted sport wheelchair tennis rules. Now, in wheelchair tennis, the ball can actually bounce 2 times and you can return it. I know many students that would have more opportunities of practice and enjoy the sport more if they were allotted 2 bounces compared to 1. So again, you could provide options for students to play by general sport or adapted sport rules. Also, assessing the skill performance for all students, right? So just because you have a student with disabilities doesn't mean that we shouldn't assess them on those sports skills. Like stated before, we can learn about similarities and differences between the general sport and adapted sport. And then we can implement and teach adapted sport within the general physical education curriculum. We could have Olympic and Paralympic units. We could teach them about blind soccer or goalball, or teach them about wheelchair basketball, right? And so expanding our curriculum to also include adaptive sports would allow our curriculum and our students to have a better understanding of individuals with disabilities and provide more inclusivity within our programming. So what are some benefits of adaptive sport within general physical education? One, making sure that physical education is a part of their IEP to make sure that they don't get exempted from it and that they're getting the required minutes that peers without disabilities are receiving in physical education. The other part is including adaptive sport within the general PE curriculum, right? It promotes inclusion, a comprehensive curriculum. It helps increase social networking for students with disabilities to have a better connection and peers without disabilities. And it can also improve their sports skills and overall fitness and endurance. Next area we're going to get into is sport classification. And so sport classification is for more of the elite level of sports within adapted sport. And it's an assessment process of the athlete that ensures competition is equitable and fair based upon the athlete's disability or impairment and minimizes that impairment or disability on their actual sport performance. So sports classification is looking for competition, or sports classification is looking for competition to be fair and equitable based upon disability impact. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
In the Paralympic Games, the classification system is essential as it defines which athletes can compete in which sports. Athletes are divided into classes based on how their impairment affects them on the field of play in order to allow fair competition. If you're new to classification, it can help to think of why men almost always compete against men and women almost always compete against women. think of it in similar terms to how boxing at the Olympic Games works, where athletes compete in different weight categories, like flyweight or heavyweight. As each sport at the Paralympic Games requires different skills and competencies, the impact of impairment on the performance of the athletes varies. That's why each sport has its own unique classification rules. Some sports feature a wide variety of impairments. In both athletics and swimming, athletes with physical, visual, and intellectual impairments compete. Other sports feature fewer types of impairment. For example, only athletes with a visual impairment take part in judo and five-a-side football at the Games. Athletics has the most number of classes due to the number of different running, jumping, and throwing events, and the wide variety of athletes that can compete in the sport. In contrast, shooting only has 2 classes. Each athlete competing at a Paralympic Games has already gone through an evaluation to determine their class. This evaluation is conducted by authorized technical officials called classifiers, who are appointed by the International Federation for that sport. This is a long-term, ongoing process which takes place at all major events, before and during competition. It ensures that the athletes are confident they are competing against each other on a level playing field. Classification won't get in the way of your enjoyment as a spectator, and will also help you further appreciate the ability and the performance of the athletes. The Paralympics is not about the impairments. It's all about elite sport. Let the Games begin.
All right, let's go ahead and check out this review.
Lexi, our on-screen guide to parasport classification. Lexi illustrates the different levels of impairment in each class by simply using 4 colors. Green indicates no impairment, red denotes a high degree of impairment, and in between, we've yellow for low and orange for moderate, and where you see a space, it represents a missing limb.
All right, so let's check out wheelchair basketball. So team sport, you're going to have participants of very low ability, right? A classification of a 1, and very high function based upon their disability with a high level of classification as a 4.5. Since this is a team sport, you have to combine classes. You can't put all of your highest levels out on the court at a time. When we're talking about individual sports where it's not team, then we would cluster a group of classifications per their score to compete together. So they're not competing against someone that has less of a impact of their disability.
A wheelchair basketball team consists of 5 players drawn from 8 classifications. Each team must not carry more than 14 points. Here, Lexi shows how. At the highly impaired end of the scale, 1-point players rely on their arms to return to an upright position and struggle to hold and catch the ball above their heads. 1.5 players are similar, though with slightly more function. 2-point players have a low degree of impairment affecting trunk control and slightly better sideways movement. Their impairments are more symmetrical, allowing for better catching. As are 2.5ers, though they have slightly better trunk control. 3-point players have good forward trunk movement and can twist well, giving the ability to change direction easily. 3.5ers are similar, though they can twist more easily, making it harder to knock them off the ball when dribbling. 4-point players have good trunk movement, though it's asymmetric, with slightly less control down one side. Minimally impaired 4.5 players have normal trunk movement in all directions and are able to reach side to side with no limitations. Catching, throwing, and maneuvering are not affected. You can now see an example spectrum across the 8 classes, from which 5 players can be chosen in any combination as long as they don't exceed the maximum of 14 points. This is Lexi's starting 5 and makes for a good team choice.
All right, so here are a few organizations that support adaptive sports within the United States. So in the lower left, we know the Paralympics is the elite level of performance for our individuals with disabilities. In the lower right, we also have Deaf Olympics for individuals that are deaf or hard of hearing. In the center, we have Special Olympics, which are for athletes that have an intellectual disability or autism. And then in the middle, on the upper part, is Warrior Games, which is put on by the Department of Defense and is for our military veterans that have been wounded and now have a disability. And they compete in different sporting events and competitions. In the center, we have the United States Association of Blind Athletes. And then to the left is Move United, which is our overall grassroots initiative for all adaptive sport through youth as a way to kind of streamline and get youth with disabilities into the Paralympics. And a separate organization used to be Disabled Sports USA, but now that falls under Move United. There's also the Paralympic sports clubs, so various different clubs related to sport. If they have programming for individuals with disabilities, they can become a Paralympic sport club. You can also become a Move United club. And different sports also have a division for individuals with disabilities, such as USA Hockey has a division under USA Hockey as the governing body, specifically for individuals with disabilities. All right, this was part 1, and go ahead and switch over to part 2 of the lecture, which will cover wheelchairs and adapted sport. Here is a picture of all the icons from the Paralympic Games from Tokyo 2020, and we have the Summer Games coming up in 2024. All right.